There are nights that change everything, nights where survival isn't guaranteed, where every breath could be your last, and where the line between human and prey becomes terrifyingly thin. 40,000 years ago, before cities, before kingdoms, before we conquered this planet, our ancestors faced a darkness we can't imagine, a darkness filled with teeth, with hunger, with predators that saw us not as masters of the earth, but as meat. This is the story of Kale, a young hunter living in what we now call the African Rift Valley, carrying a wound no spear could heal, the loss of his younger brother to the very beasts that ruled the night. Giant hyenas, creatures twice the size of any hyena alive today, with jaws strong enough to crack elephant bones and an intelligence that rivaled our own. What happened on that one terrifying night didn't just determine whether Kyle would see another sunrise. It determined whether humanity itself would survive to inherit the earth. If you want to discover how our ancestors defeated the ultimate predator, subscribe now and stay with me until the end. This story will change how you see survival forever. Kyle's hands trembled as he sharpened the obsidian blade, the same blade his brother Asher had used on his last hunt. 6 moons had passed since that day, 6 moons since Kale had returned to their cave shelter, carrying only a torn piece of hide, and a silence that screamed louder than any words could. The Rift Valley stretched before him, a sprawling expanse of golden grasslands dotted with acacia trees, their twisted branches reaching toward a sky that burned orange and purple in the fading light. 60,000 years of human history hadn't been written yet. There were no nations, no agriculture, no written language. Only about 10,000 humans existed on the entire African continent, scattered in small family groups, clinging to existence in a world that wanted them dead. Kyle was 23 summers old, ancient by the standards of his time. Most didn't live past 30. His tribe, the Pale Rock clan, numbered only 18 members. They lived in a network of caves carved into limestone cliffs, overlooking a waterhole that attracted both life and death in equal measure. His mother, Nima, hadn't spoken since Asher's death. She sat by the fire each night, weaving grass into baskets she'd never finish, her eyes fixed on nothing. His father, Orak, the clan's leader, had grown harder, more distant. "We don't mourn what we can't change," he'd said the night Kyle returned without his brother. "We survive. That's all we do." But Kale couldn't let it go. The memory played over and over, Asher's scream cutting through the twilight, the massive shape emerging from the tall grass, hyena but not hyena. This creature stood 4 feet tall at the shoulder, its body rippling with muscle, its head the size of a boulder. Pachyrhocutta brevirostris, though Kyle had no scientific name for it. They called them the Bone Crushers. Asher had been 15, eager to prove himself as a hunter. They'd been tracking a wounded gazelle when the pack found them. Not the creature, them. Kale had frozen, his spear feeling like a twig in his hands as 6 pairs of eyes reflected the dying light. The alpha female, scarred and enormous, had locked eyes with Asher. Kale had run. He'd run, and Asher's screams had followed him until they didn't anymore. The guilt was a living thing inside him, gnawing at his insides the way those hyenas had gnawed his brother's bones. The clan elders said the Bone Crushers were spirits, demons who walked the line between animal and something darker. They hunted in packs of 10 or more, using strategy that mimicked human tactics, flanking, ambushing, waiting. Now as Kale sat on the cliff's edge, watching the sun sink below the horizon, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Tracks, fresh tracks in the soft dirt near the cave entrance. Massive paw prints, each one the size of his hand, leading up from the waterhole toward their shelter. The Bone Crushers had never come this close before. They hunted in the grasslands, in the open spaces where their size and speed gave them advantage. But these tracks told a different story. They were learning, adapting, and they were coming for the Pale Rock clan. Kale stood slowly, his obsidian blade gripping tight in his hand, and that's when he heard it, a low, rumbling laugh, echoing from somewhere in the darkness below. A sound that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite anything else. They were already here. Kyle's warning cry shattered the evening calm. Within seconds, the entire clan scrambled into motion, mothers grabbing children, elders seizing weapons, everyone moving toward the deeper recesses of the cave system. This was the protocol they'd practiced since childhood. When the predators came, you retreated to the narrow passages where size became a disadvantage. But Aurak stood frozen at the cave mouth, staring at something beyond the tracks. "Kyle," he whispered, his voice carrying a tremor Kyle had never heard before. "Come here now." Kyle approached his father, spear raised, expecting to see the gleaming eyes of the bone crushers emerging from the twilight. Instead, Aurak pointed to a spot 30 feet down the cliff face, where a rockfall from the previous week's storm had revealed something impossible. A cave. A hidden cave they'd never known existed, carved into the limestone behind a collapsed section of rock. And inside, even from this distance, Kyle could see them. Paintings, handprints, symbols. The Old Ones, Aurak breathed. This was their shelter. The Old Ones were legend, whispered about in stories around fires. A group of humans who'd lived in these cliffs generations before the Pale Rock clan, who'd mysteriously vanished without trace. Some said they'd been wiped out by the bone crushers. Others claimed they'd moved north, following the great herds. No one knew for certain. That hyena laugh echoed again, closer now, and Kyle saw movement in the grass below, shapes circling, at least 8 of them, massive bodies moving with terrible coordination. The pack was larger than any he'd seen. "We need to get inside," Kyle urged, but Aurak was already climbing down toward the revealed cave, moving with a recklessness that bordered on madness. "Father, no!" But Aurak disappeared into the opening. Kyle looked back at his clan, his mother's hollow eyes watching from the safety of the deep cave, the children huddled together, the warriors forming a defensive line. Then he looked down at the circling predators, their massive forms barely visible in the fading light. He made his choice and climbed down after his father. The hidden cave was smaller than their main shelter, but the walls told a story that made Kyle's skin prickle with electricity. Handprints in red ochre, dozens of them arranged in patterns, drawings of the sun, the moon, the stars. And there, covering the entire back wall, a massive painting of the bone crushers, rendered in charcoal and blood, surrounding a circle of human figures. But it wasn't a scene of slaughter. The humans and the hyenas were facing outward, together towards something else, something the artist had painted in black pigment so thick it seemed to absorb the light from Kale's torch. A shape, massive, with wings spread wide, talons extended, eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. "The terror bird," Aurak whispered, running his fingers across a series of marks carved into the stone beneath the painting. They looked like tallies, like counting marks. Hundreds of them. They weren't killed by the bone crushers, Kale. They made peace with them. They had to. Kale's mind reeled. That's impossible. The bone crushers kill everything. To fight something worse. Aurak pointed to a leather bundle wedged into a crack in the rock, preserved by the dry air. Inside were bones. Carved bones forming tools, weapons, and some. Kyle grabbed the necklace from his father's hands and shoved it into his pouch as the scraping of claws grew louder. They had seconds, maybe less. But Aurak wasn't moving. He was transfixed by the carvings beneath the painting, his fingers tracing the symbols with desperate intensity. "Father, we have to go now." "These marks," Aurak interrupted, his voice shaking. "They're not tallies. They're a calendar. Moon cycles." He counted frantically, his lips moving. 28 marks repeated. The Old Ones were tracking something. Every 28 days, the same pattern. A massive head appeared in the cave entrance, blocking out the starlight. The alpha female, even larger than Kale remembered, her scarred face dominated by jaws that could shear through bone like soft clay. Her eyes, intelligent and ancient, fixed on them with an intensity that felt almost human. She didn't attack. She stood there, filling the entrance completely, her hot breath creating clouds in the cooling air. Waiting. Kyle raised his spear, knowing how useless it was. One swipe of those paws would shatter his skull. But the creature just stared, her gaze moving between Kyle and the painting behind him, and then, impossibly, she made a sound. Not a laugh, not a growl, something else, a whine, almost plaintive. "She's trying to tell us something," Aurak whispered, and Kyle thought his father had finally lost his mind. But then the hyena did something that would haunt Kale forever. She stepped aside, revealing the landscape beyond, and looked up at the sky. Kyle followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. The moon, full and bloated, hanging low on the horizon like a great white eye. But around it, barely visible, a reddish halo was forming, a phenomenon Kale had seen only once before, 6 moons ago, the night Asher died. "The blood moon," Kale breathed. "It's happening again. Orak was frantically studying the wall now, and suddenly he gasped. "Kyle, look at this. The old ones, they wrote it in the symbols. When the moon bleeds, the Sky Terror wakes. When the Sky Terror wakes, all groundwalkers must unite or perish." The alpha female whined again, more urgent this time, and then Kyle heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the earth. A screech, high and piercing, coming from somewhere in the darkening sky. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Orak grabbed Kyle's shoulders, his eyes wild. The terror bird isn't a legend. It's real. And it comes every 28 moons during the blood moon to hunt. That's why the old ones made peace with the bone crushers. They had to. They couldn't survive it alone. Another screech split the air, closer now, and the alpha female turned her massive head skyward, her lips pulling back from teeth the size of daggers. But Kyle saw something he never expected to see in a predator's eyes: fear. Down in the grasslands below, he could hear his clan screaming. Not from hyena attacks. They were screaming at something else, something from above. The warriors were trying to light fires. Children were being dragged into the caves. And through it all, that terrible screeching grew louder, accompanied by a sound like thunder but rhythmic. Measured wings, massive wings beating the air. The alpha female looked at Kale one last time, and in her ancient eyes, he saw a question that transcended species. Would the humans remember? Would they honor the old pact? Or would they all die tonight separately as prey? Then she turned and leaped down the cliff face, racing toward her pack. Racing toward a war that had been fought every 28 moons, for longer than human memory. And Kale understood, 6 moons ago. Asher hadn't been murdered by the bone crushers. He'd been caught in the crossfire of something far worse. Kyle and Orak scrambled up the cliff face, their hands bleeding from the sharp limestone, driven by pure terror. When they reached the main cave entrance, the sight before them turned Kale's blood to ice water. The sky was moving. Not clouds, not wind. The sky itself seemed to ripple with living darkness. And then the blood moon's crimson light revealed the truth. Wings. Enormous wings spanning 20 feet or more, attached to a creature that evolution had designed for one purpose only: to kill from above. Titanis walleri. The terror bird. 8 feet tall with a head like an axe blade, a beak that could punch through a human skull like it was eggshell, and talons that curved like scythes. But this wasn't just one creature. There were 3 of them, circling above the valley like demons performing some ancient ritual. The Pale Rock clan was in chaos. Warriors threw spears that bounced uselessly off armored feathers. Mothers clutched screaming children. And down in the grasslands, Kale could see the Bone Crusher pack forming a tight circle. Their massive bodies pressed together, facing outward, ready for the aerial assault they knew was coming. They hunt in patterns. Orak shouted over the screeching. The old ones documented it. The terror birds dive in rotation, never more than 2 at a time, while the third circles to prevent escape. As if hearing his words, one of the massive birds folded its wings and dropped like a stone toward the hyena pack. But the bone crushers were ready. At the last second, they scattered in perfect coordination, and the terror bird's talons raked only empty earth. Before it could recover, the alpha female and 2 males converged, their massive jaws snapping at wings and legs, driving the bird back into the air with savage efficiency. They'd fought this battle before. Many times Kale's mind raced. The necklace in his pouch, human and hyena bones woven together, it wasn't just a symbol of peace. It was a strategy, a blueprint for survival passed down through generations. The old ones had learned that neither species could win this fight alone, but together. "We have to help them," Kyle said, and even as the words left his mouth, he couldn't believe he was saying them. Help the creatures that had killed his brother. But Orak was already nodding, his face grim. The pattern repeats every 28 moons. If we don't stop the terror birds tonight, they'll return. They'll always return, and eventually they'll wipe us all out, hyena and human alike. Kale looked at his mother, still sitting by the fire, her empty eyes reflecting the flames. He thought of Asher, of his brother's final screams. The hate he'd carried for 6 moons felt like a poison now, burning through him, blinding him to the larger truth. The bone crushers hadn't killed Asher out of malice. They'd been fighting for their own survival. And Asher had simply been in the wrong place during the last blood moon, collateral damage in a war older than human memory. A second terror bird dove, this time toward the caves. Kyle raised his spear, but before he could throw, something impossible happened. The alpha female bone crusher, the same one from the hidden cave, appeared at the base of the cliff and did something that defied everything Kale thought he knew about the natural world. She howled. Not a hunting call, not a territorial warning. It was a specific pattern of sounds repeated 3 times, and from the hidden cave behind them, carved into the stone where Aurak had been studying the symbols, a response echoed. The same pattern, preserved in the acoustics of the ancient rock. It was a call sign, a rallying cry. The old ones had left them instructions not just in paintings and bones, but in sound itself. A way to signal the pact. The howl that tore from Kale's throat wasn't entirely human. It carried 6 moons of grief, of guilt, of rage that had festered like an infected wound. But it also carried something else. Acceptance. The sound echoed across the valley, and for a moment everything stopped. The terror birds circled higher, confused by this new variable. The Bone Crusher pack turned as one toward the caves, their massive heads tilting in what almost looked like surprise. And Kyle's own clan stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Kyle, what have you done?" one of the elders screamed, but Aurak stepped forward, his voice booming across the settlement. "The old pact is honored. Humans and Bone Crushers stand together tonight, or we all die separately." The alpha female moved first. She bounded up the cliff face with terrifying agility, her pack following, and Kyle's people scattered in panic. But she didn't attack. Instead, she positioned herself at the cave entrance, her massive body forming a living barrier, her pack spreading out in defensive positions that, Kyle realized with shock, perfectly complemented human defensive strategies. They were forming a perimeter. Together, spears ready, Kyle shouted, his voice finding strength he didn't know he possessed. "When the terror birds dive, the Bone Crushers will draw them low. We strike at their wings and eyes." A young warrior named Tiva stared at him, trembling. "You want us to fight beside the monsters that killed your brother?" Kale felt the weight of Asher's blade in his hand, felt the familiar burn of hatred trying to surface. But then he looked at the sky, at the 3 circling nightmares that made the Bone Crushers look like cubs by comparison, and he understood something profound. "My brother wasn't killed by monsters," Kale said quietly. "He was killed by my ignorance. By our ignorance. These creatures have been fighting this battle for generations, and we never knew. We never helped. Harsha died because we broke a covenant we didn't even remember existed." The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the scent of rain. A storm was building in the west, dark clouds swallowing stars, and Kyle felt the temperature plummet. Nature itself seemed to be choosing sides, gathering its forces for the confrontation. Then the terror birds attacked in full force. All 3 dove simultaneously. A change in pattern, a new strategy. The lead bird targeted the hyena pack, the second aimed for the clustered humans, and the third, the largest, dropped toward the fire, toward Kale's mother, who still sat motionless, lost in her grief. Time crystallized. Kale saw everything with perfect clarity. The alpha female leaping to intercept the first terror bird, her jaws closing on its leg, with bone-crushing force. Aurak and the warriors launching spears at the second, their obsidian points finding purchase in wing membranes. And the third, the monster, its shadow falling over his mother like a death shroud. Kale ran. His legs pumped faster than they ever had, faster than the night he'd abandoned Asher. But this time he wasn't running away, he was running toward. The terror bird's talons extended, its beak opened wide, and Kale knew with absolute certainty he wouldn't reach her in time. But something else did. From the shadows of the deep cave, a figure emerged, smaller than the Bone Crushers, leaner, moving with a limp. And around its neck hung strips of torn hide that Kale recognized instantly. Asher's clothing. The young hyena, barely more than a juvenile, threw itself at the terror bird with suicidal courage, its smaller jaws finding the bird's throat, its claws raking at eyes. The terror bird shrieked and changed trajectory, crashing into the cave wall instead of Kale's mother. And Kale understood the final, devastating truth. Asher hadn't been killed. He'd been taken. Injured, perhaps dying, but taken by the pack and saved, raised. The young hyena, fighting to protect Kale's mother, moved with a strange, almost human intelligence in its eyes. The storm broke overhead with a crack of thunder that shook the earth, and rain began to pour in sheets, and Kyle stood frozen between two impossible realities. His brother was gone, but his spirit somehow lived on in the very creature he'd been taught to hate. The largest terror bird recovered, shaking off the young hyena, and turned its ancient, pitiless gaze directly on Kyle, and he knew this was it, the moment that would determine everything. The largest terror bird stood 8 feet of pure prehistoric fury, its feathers slick with rain, its beak stained with the blood of 1,000 kills across 1,000 blood moons. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the scene in stark white flashes, Kyle with his obsidian blade, the young hyena struggling to stand, and between them, his mother finally moving, finally awakening from her grief-induced trance. "Kyle," she whispered, her first word in 6 moons, and in her eyes he saw recognition, not of him but of the young hyena. She saw what he saw. The way it moved, the tilt of its head, even the scar pattern on its flank that matched wounds Asher had carried from a childhood fall. The terror bird screeched and lunged, but Kyle was already moving. He didn't think, didn't plan. His body acted on instinct honed by 40,000 years of human evolution, designed for exactly this moment. He dove left, rolled, and came up throwing. The obsidian blade, Asher's blade, spun through the rain-soaked air and buried itself in the terror bird's eye. The creature's shriek could have shattered stone. It reared back, talons raking the air, and that's when the storm truly revealed its allegiance. A massive bolt of lightning struck the acacia tree at the valley's edge, and the ancient wood exploded into flame, despite the downpour. The fire spread with impossible speed, creating a wall of light and heat that drove the other 2 terror birds away from their attacks. The alpha female bone crusher seized the moment. With a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself, she rallied her pack, and they swarmed the wounded terror bird like a single organism. Jaws found wings, claws found joints, and the creature that had terrorized both their species for generations was dragged down into the mud. But Kyle wasn't watching the kill. He was running to the young hyena, to the creature that couldn't be but somehow was. Up close he could see it now. The intelligence in those eyes wasn't just hyena. There was something else there, something learned, something human. Aurak appeared at his side, breathing hard, covered in blood that wasn't his own. "The pack found him that night," his father said, his voice breaking. "Wounded but alive. The alpha female. She must have recognized something in him. Maybe the courage of a young hunter. Maybe just mercy. They raised him among their cubs. He became both and neither. The young hyena, Asher, not Asher, something in between, limped forward and pressed his massive head against Kyle's mother. She wrapped her arms around his neck and wept. And the sound was every mother who'd ever lost a child, finding something she thought was gone forever. The wounded terror bird was dying, the pack's jaws having done their work, but the other 2 circled above, screeching their rage, waiting for another opening. Kyle looked at his clan, 18 humans, exhausted, terrified, armed with Stone Age weapons. Then he looked at the Bone Crusher pack, 9 massive predators, scarred from countless blood moon battles, led by a female who'd done something impossible. She'd chosen alliance over instinct. "Form the circle," Kyle shouted, remembering the painting in the hidden cave. "The old ones showed us how." The clan moved without question now, their trust in Kyle absolute. They formed a tight circle around the fire, spears pointing outward. And the Bone Crushers, understanding with that eerie intelligence, filled the gaps between humans, creating a formation that was neither human nor hyena, but something greater than both. The remaining terror birds dove together, a final coordinated strike, meant to shatter the alliance before it could solidify. But the circle held. Human spears found wing membranes while hyena jaws found legs. The storm intensified, wind and rain creating a maelstrom that battered the flying predators, while the ground dwellers stood firm, anchored together. One terror bird fell, speared through the heart by 3 obsidian points thrown in perfect unison. The last one, seeing its companions dead or dying, did something that would be carved into the stones of the hidden cave later. It fled. For the first time in the recorded memory of this ancient war, a terror bird retreated, flying north toward the mountains, screeching its fury at the blood moon that had witnessed its defeat. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the battlefield lay quiet. 3 terror birds dead, their massive bodies already being claimed by the earth. 0 humans lost, 2 bone crushers injured but alive. And in the center of it all, Kale stood with his hand on the young hyena's head, understanding that some losses never heal. They transform into something else entirely. The alpha female approached slowly, and for a long moment, human and hyena simply looked at each other. Then she dipped her massive head, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. The pact was restored. More than restored, it was reborn, stronger because now both species understood the price of breaking it. Orak placed the ancient necklace around Kale's neck, human and hyena bones intertwined. "You'll be the keeper of the covenant now," his father said. "You'll teach your children, and they'll teach theirs, so that we never forget again." But Kale was looking at the young hyena, at the creature that was his brother and wasn't, and he understood something profound. Evolution. The blood moon faded as the sun rose higher, and with it the immediate threat passed. But Kale knew, they all knew, that in 28 moons the cycle would begin again. The terror birds would return, drawn by instinct and ancient pattern to hunt during the blood moon. But next time, humanity and the bone crushers would be ready. Together. This is how our ancestors survived. Not through domination, not through conquest, but through the courage to see beyond their own pain and recognize that survival sometimes means embracing the very thing you fear most. Kale's story reminds us that the greatest threat isn't always the predator in the darkness. Sometimes it's our own refusal to change, to adapt, to unite. What do you think? Could you have made the same choice Kale did? Could you have fought alongside the creatures that took everything from you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, because history's most powerful stories are the ones we almost forgot. So until next time, remember, we're all survivors of impossible